The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 7, casting long rectangles of light across the polished wooden floor. The room buzzed with the usual Monday morning energy. Lawyers in crisp suits huddled with clients, court reporters setting up their equipment, and clerks shuffling papers at their stations. Judge Diane Blackwood's courtroom had a reputation for strict professionalism and efficiency. At 58, with her silver-streaked hair always pulled back in a tight bun and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, she commanded respect with just a glance. "All rise," called the bailiff as Judge Blackwood entered, her black robes flowing behind her. The room fell silent as she took her seat at the bench, adjusting her microphone and scanning the day's docket with practiced efficiency. "First case, Riverfront Properties versus Alex Lynn," she announced, her voice carrying throughout the courtroom without effort. "Are both parties present?" The plaintiff's attorney, a middle-aged man with an expensive haircut and a tailored suit, stood immediately. "Gregory Parker for Riverfront Properties, Your Honor." Judge Blackwood nodded and turned her attention to the other side of the courtroom. There was a brief pause, followed by a slight commotion as someone made their way through the gallery. The judge frowned, peering over her glasses. A young man who couldn't have been older than 19 approached the defendant's table. He wore faded jeans, slightly too big for his frame, and a plain blue button-up shirt that looked like it had been hastily ironed that morning. His dark hair fell messily across his forehead, and he carried a worn backpack instead of a briefcase. "You are Mr. Lynn?" Judge Blackwood asked, her voice already tinged with skepticism. The young man cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. Alex Lynn. I'm representing myself in this matter." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. A few chuckles rippled through the courtroom. Judge Blackwood's mouth tightened at the corners. "Very well," she said, making no effort to hide the doubt in her voice. "This is a rather complex property dispute, Mr. Lynn. Are you certain you wouldn't prefer to have counsel represent you?" Alex shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "I've done some research, Your Honor. I think I understand the case well enough." Another ripple of amusement spread through the spectators. Even Parker, the plaintiff's attorney, allowed himself a small, confident smile. "I see," said Judge Blackwood. "Mr. Parker, please present your client's case." Parker rose smoothly, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced ease. "Your Honor, this is a straightforward matter of property encroachment and violation of neighborhood covenants. My client, Riverfront Properties, owns the apartment complex adjacent to Mr. Lynn's grandmother's house. We have documentation showing that recent renovations to Mrs. Lynn's property have extended approximately 2 feet beyond her property line, infringing on Riverfront's land. Additionally, these renovations violate 3 separate neighborhood covenants that were established in 1986. He approached the bench with a thick folder of documents. "I've prepared copies of the relevant deeds, surveys, and covenant restrictions for the court." Judge Blackwood accepted the folder and began examining the contents. "And what remedy is your client seeking, Mr. Parker?" "Removal of the encroaching structures, Your Honor, as well as damages in the amount of $25,000 for diminished property value and violation of the aesthetic standards outlined in the covenant." Judge Blackwood raised her eyebrows. $25,000 is quite substantial for a 2-foot encroachment. The damages reflect not only the physical encroachment but also the impact on the marketability of the adjacent units in my client's building, Parker explained smoothly. "We have expert testimony prepared to substantiate this valuation." The judge nodded and turned to Alex. "Mr. Lynn, your response?" Alex fumbled with his backpack, pulling out a folder bursting with disorganized papers. Several sheets slipped from his grasp and fluttered to the floor. The young man dropped to his knees, hastily gathering them up as more muffled laughter filled the courtroom. "Sorry, Your Honor," he mumbled, his cheeks flushing red as he finally stood. Clutching his papers in disarray, Judge Blackwood sighed audibly. "Mr. Lynn, this court operates on a schedule. Please try to be prepared." "Yes, Your Honor, sorry." Alex took a deep breath. "My grandmother has owned her house for over 40 years. She's 84 now and has trouble getting around. The renovations were just a small ramp and handrail so she could get in and out of her house safely." His voice grew slightly stronger as he continued. "We hired a contractor who told us everything was within our property line. We have the permits from the city, too." He held up a wrinkled document that had been folded multiple times. Judge Blackwood pinched the bridge of her nose. "Mr. Lynn, Proper documentation needs to be submitted formally, not waved around in my courtroom. Do you have copies for the plaintiff and the court? Alex's face fell. I only have this one. Parker leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. Judge Blackwood shook her head slightly. Mr. Lynn, are you familiar with the rules of civil procedure in this court? She asked. I've been reading about them online, Alex replied. Reading about them online, Judge Blackwood repeated, not bothering to hide her disdain. Tell me, what specific defense are you raising to Mr. Parker's claims? Alex shifted through his papers, clearly searching for something. I believe there's a problem with the property line they're using. The survey they're referencing is from when the apartment building was first built in 1990, but there was an adjustment made in 1997 after. Mr. Lynn, the judge interrupted. This is precisely why legal matters are best left to professionals. Law isn't something you can simply Google the night before court. Several spectators laughed openly now. Parker didn't bother hiding his smirk. Your Honor, Alex tried again. I have some documentation about the property line adjustment, if I could just find it. He began frantically searching through his disorganized papers again. Judge Blackwood checked her watch. Mr. Lynn, this court sees dozens of cases like this every month. Young people who think they know better than professionals often find themselves in difficult positions. Her tone was the kind reserved for lecturing children. This isn't like disputing a parking ticket. I understand that, Your Honor, Alex said, his voice smaller now. Do you? Judge Blackwood continued. Because from where I'm sitting, it appears you've put your elderly grandmother in jeopardy of a substantial financial judgment because you thought watching a few episodes of legal dramas qualified you to handle a real estate dispute. Alex stared at his shoes. Your Honor, Parker interjected smoothly, given the defendant's obvious lack of preparation, perhaps we could request a summary judgment. It would save the court's valuable time. Judge Blackwood considered this for a moment. That seems reasonable, Mr. Parker, but I'll give Mr. Lynn one more opportunity to present an actual defense. She turned back to Alex. Well, do you have anything substantive to offer this court? Alex took a deep breath and looked up, meeting the judge's eyes. Your Honor, I'd like to request a brief recess to organize my materials. I promise I'm not wasting the court's time. My grandmother's home means everything to her, and this ramp is the only way she can safely enter and exit. The apartment owners never complained when we were building it. They waited until it was finished and then immediately filed this lawsuit. Something in his earnest tone gave Judge Blackwood pause. She studied the young man for a moment. Very well, Mr. Lynn. The court will take a 15-minute recess. I suggest you use that time wisely. She tapped her gavel once. Court is in recess. As everyone rose, Alex quickly gathered his scattered papers and retreated to a corner of the courtroom. Judge Blackwood watched him for a moment before disappearing into her chambers. In the hallway outside, Parker approached Alex with an air of casual superiority. Listen, kid, he said, his voice low. This doesn't have to get ugly. We can settle this right now. Your grandmother removes the ramp, pays $5,000 for violations, and we'll forget the rest. Alex looked up from his papers. The ramp is within our property line, Mr. Parker, and my grandmother needs it. Parker laughed lightly. Come on, you're in over your head. I've been practicing law for 20 years. Judge Blackwood has already made up her mind. Anyone can see that. Then I guess I'll have to change it, Alex replied quietly. Parker shook his head. Your funeral, kid. Offer expires when we walk back in there. He turned and walked away, already dialing his phone. Alex leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. The weight of the responsibility, his grandmother's home, her independence, her safety, pressed down on him. He thought about how Judge Blackwood had looked at him, with that mixture of impatience and dismissal that adults often reserved for teenagers they'd already written off. He opened his backpack again, pulled out a folder he hadn't shown yet, and took a deep breath. The bailiff called for everyone to return to the courtroom. As Alex walked back to the defendant's table, he straightened his shoulders ever so slightly. His expression had changed, subtle but noticeable to anyone paying close attention. The nervous energy was still there, but underneath it, something else had begun to emerge. The real battle was just about to begin. The 15-minute recess ended with the sharp rap of Judge Blackwood's gavel. The courtroom settled quickly as she adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Alex. Mr. Lin, are you prepared to continue now? Her tone made it clear she expected little improvement. Yes, Your Honor, thank you for the recess. Alex's voice was steadier now, the nervous tremor noticeably absent. Judge Blackwood nodded curtly. Very well. Mr. Parker has presented his client's case clearly. The documentation appears to support Riverfront Properties' claim that your grandmother's ramp encroaches on their property and violates neighborhood covenants. Do you have a substantive response, or shall we proceed to judgment? Alex stood straighter, making brief eye contact with Parker before addressing the judge. Your Honor, I'd like to first address the survey issue. He reached for a folder that was now neatly positioned on the table before him. The scattered mess of papers was gone, replaced by 3 organized stacks. May I approach? He asked, holding up a document. Judge Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly at his improved demeanor. You may. Alex walked forward confidently, his sneakers no longer shuffling but striding purposefully across the polished floor. He handed a document to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. This is the 1997 property line adjustment I mentioned earlier, Alex explained. It was filed after a city water main replacement affected several properties in the neighborhood, including my grandmother's and what was then Riverside Apartments, before Riverfront Properties purchased the building in 2015. Parker leaned forward in his chair, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. The adjustment shifted the boundary by 3 feet in favor of my grandmother's property, Alex continued, his voice growing more confident with each word. This means the ramp we constructed is entirely within our property line, with approximately 12 inches to spare. Judge Blackwood studied the document, her expression unchanging. And you can authenticate this document, Mr. Lin? Yes, Your Honor. Alex returned to his table and retrieved 2 more copies, one for the court and one for opposing counsel. The original is on file with the county recorder's office. I've taken the liberty of highlighting the relevant sections on page 3. He handed one copy to Parker, who accepted it with a slight frown forming between his eyebrows. The attorney flipped to the 3rd page, his frown deepening as he read. Judge Blackwood looked up from her copy. Mr. Parker, are you familiar with this property line adjustment? Parker cleared his throat. Your Honor, this is the first I'm seeing this document. Our survey was conducted by a licensed professional just last month. I would question the authenticity of... The document bears the county seal and recorder's signature. Alex interrupted politely but firmly. Additionally, I've brought a certified copy of the original survey map. He held up another document. May I approach again, Your Honor? Judge Blackwood was now watching Alex with growing interest. She nodded, and Alex presented the map to the court. As you can see, he continued, pointing to specific markings on the map. The water main replacement required a slight realignment of property boundaries for 5 properties on the block. The adjustment was fully compensated by the city at the time. Interestingly, this information would have been disclosed in any proper title search when Riverfront Properties purchased the apartment building in 2015. Parker was now flipping through his own files with increased urgency. Judge Blackwood studied the map carefully, then looked at Parker. Mr. Parker, your response? The attorney straightened his tie. Your Honor, if I may have a moment to confer with my client. By all means, Judge Blackwood replied, her tone noticeably less dismissive than when she'd granted Alex's earlier request for time. As Parker stepped away to speak with a man in an expensive suit sitting behind the plaintiff's table, Alex remained standing, his posture relaxed but attentive. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. His eyes were clearer, more focused, and he organized papers on his table with practiced ease. Judge Blackwood watched him quietly. When Parker returned to his table, she spoke again. Let's move on to the second issue, the alleged violation of neighborhood covenants. Mr. Lin? Alex nodded. Yes, Your Honor. Regarding the covenants, I'd like to direct the court's attention to the Americans with Disabilities Act, specifically Title III as it applies to existing facilities. He produced another document from his now well-organized folder. The accessibility modifications to my grandmother's home fall under protected accommodations that supersede neighborhood aesthetic covenants. He approached again with copies for the court and opposing counsel. Additionally, the neighborhood covenants themselves contain a provision for medical necessities on page 7. Paragraph 4, which states that modifications required for the health and safety of residents shall be permitted provided they maintain the general character of the neighborhood. Judge Blackwood adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the highlighted section. Mr. Parker, your response to this point. Parker looked increasingly uncomfortable. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the ADA provisions, we contend that the modifications go beyond what's necessary for accessibility and therefore violate the covenant's aesthetic standards unnecessarily. I anticipated that objection, Alex responded, his voice now carrying the measured cadence of someone completely at home in a courtroom. If I may, Your Honor? At the judge's nod, Alex produced photographs. These show the ramp and handrail from various angles. The materials used match the existing house siding and trim. We specifically designed it to blend with the property's appearance. We even consulted an architect who specializes in accessible design to ensure it would be both functional and aesthetically appropriate. He handed the photos to the bailiff. You'll also note that we planted landscaping around the base of the ramp to further integrate it with the existing garden. Far from diminishing property values, these thoughtful modifications actually enhance the neighborhood by demonstrating inclusive design principles. Judge Blackwood studied the photos carefully, passing them to Parker when she finished. The attorney glanced at them briefly before setting them aside. Your Honor, Parker began, his confident demeanor notably diminished. Regardless of the aesthetic considerations, my client still has concerns about the precedent this sets for other properties in the development. Precedent? Alex echoed, a new edge in his voice. You mean the precedent of allowing elderly and disabled residents to access their homes safely? That's a precedent I would think any responsible property developer would want to encourage. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Blackwood tapped her gavel once, but her eyes remained fixed on Alex with growing curiosity. Mr. Lynn, she said slowly, your argument is surprisingly comprehensive for someone who appeared so unprepared earlier. Alex straightened his shoulders. I apologize if my initial presentation seemed disorganized, Your Honor. Sometimes appearances can be misleading. Judge Blackwood's eyes narrowed slightly. Indeed they can. Let me ask you directly, Mr. Lynn, do you have legal training? A hush fell over the courtroom. Parker leaned forward, suddenly alert. Alex met the judge's gaze steadily. Your Honor, I believe the merits of the case should be evaluated based on the facts and arguments presented, not on my personal background. That doesn't answer my question, Judge Blackwood pressed. With respect, Your Honor, it's the only answer I can provide at this time. Alex's voice remained polite but firm. The courtroom was completely silent now. Judge Blackwood studied Alex for a long moment before speaking again. Very well. Let's continue with the matter at hand. Mr. Parker, do you have any evidence to counter Mr. Lynn's property line documentation? Parker conferred briefly with his client again before responding. Your Honor, in light of the 1997 adjustment document, we would like to request a brief continuance to verify its authenticity and implications. A reasonable request, Judge Blackwood acknowledged. And what about the covenant violation claims? Do you maintain those as well? Parker hesitated. We would need to review the ADA provisions more thoroughly as they relate to this specific situation. Judge Blackwood nodded. I see. She turned back to Alex. Mr. Lynn, would you object to a 1-week continuance to allow the plaintiff to review the documentation you've presented today? No objection, Your Honor, Alex replied. However, I would request that any continuance include an order preventing riverfront properties from taking any action against my grandmother's property in the interim. That seems reasonable, Judge Blackwood agreed. This matter is continued until next Monday at 9 a.m. Riverfront Properties is ordered to take no action regarding the property in question until this case is resolved. We're adjourned. She tapped her gavel once. As the courtroom began to clear, Parker approached Alex with a much different demeanor than before. Where did that come from? He asked quietly. You're not just some kid, are you? Alex gathered his materials calmly. Like I said, Mr. Parker, appearances can be misleading. From her bench, Judge Blackwood watched the exchange with intense interest. There was clearly more to this young man than met the eye, and she intended to find out exactly what before this case concluded. As Alex walked out of the courtroom, several observers whispered among themselves. The shabby teenager, who had been laughed at just an hour ago now, moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The real question was, Who was Alex Lynn, really? The week between court sessions passed quickly. In her chambers, Judge Blackwood sat at her desk, a steaming cup of coffee beside her and a stack of files in front. But instead of reviewing the day's docket, she was staring at her computer screen, completely absorbed in what she was reading. Your Honor? Her clerk, Tina, appeared at the door. Court begins in 15 minutes. Judge Blackwood barely looked up. Thank you, Tina. And has our young Mr. Lynn arrived yet? Yes, Your Honor. He's in the hallway reviewing his notes. And Mr. Parker just arrived with 2 associates and his client. Judge Blackwood nodded, still focused on her screen. Interesting. Please tell Bailiff Thompson I'll be out in 10 minutes. After Tina left, Judge Blackwood leaned back in her chair and removed her glasses, rubbing the bridge of her nose. What she had discovered over the past week had left her both impressed and somewhat embarrassed. She closed the browser tab showing the academic journal article authored by one Alex Lynn, then shut down her computer and gathered her robes. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was noticeably different from the previous week. The gallery was fuller, with several attorneys from other cases lingering to watch. Word had spread about the teenager who had turned the tables on one of the city's most successful real estate attorneys. Alex sat at the defendant's table, dressed much the same as before, simple jeans and a button-up shirt, but his hair was slightly neater and his posture more composed. The backpack still sat beside him, but today he also had a slim laptop open in front of him. At the plaintiff's table, Parker had been joined by 2 younger attorneys who were busily sorting through documents. The owner of Riverfront Properties, Michael Weber, sat beside them with a stern expression, occasionally leaning over to whisper something to Parker. When Judge Blackwood entered, the room stood and then settled quickly. She surveyed the courtroom before speaking. Good morning. We're here to continue the matter of Riverfront Properties versus Lynn. Mr. Parker, I understand you've had a week to review the documentation presented by Mr. Lynn. Are you prepared to proceed? Parker stood, buttoning his suit jacket. Yes, Your Honor. After careful review, we acknowledge the validity of the 1997 property line adjustment. Our survey team failed to account for this document in their assessment. He cleared his throat. However, we maintain our position regarding the covenant violations and are prepared to present expert testimony on the impact of the modifications on neighborhood property values. Judge Blackwood nodded. Very well. And Mr. Lynn, are you prepared to continue your defense? Alex closed his laptop and stood. Yes, Your Honor. Before we proceed, Judge Blackwood said, I'd like to address something that has come to my attention. She fixed Alex with a direct gaze. Mr. Lynn, are you currently enrolled at Pacific Coast University School of Law? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Alex stood perfectly still for a moment before answering. Yes, Your Honor, I am. And isn't it true that you're not merely enrolled, but are in fact a teaching fellow in constitutional law and civil procedure? The murmurs grew louder. Parker's mouth fell open slightly. That is correct, Your Honor, Alex admitted, his voice calm. Judge Blackwood continued, and prior to your teaching position, you completed your law degree at Yale at the age of 20, graduating first in your class, and subsequently clerked for Justice Ramirez at the State Supreme Court? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Judge Blackwood tapped her gavel once and silence immediately returned. Yes, Your Honor, Alex replied, though I'm 24 now, not 19 as I may have. Allowed people to believe. I see. Judge Blackwood removed her glasses. Would you care to explain why you presented yourself as an inexperienced teenager, rather than the accomplished legal scholar you actually are? Alex took a deep breath and looked around the courtroom before answering. Your Honor, the case involving my grandmother's property is genuine. She does need the accessibility modifications, and everything I presented about the property line and covenant provisions is factual. He paused. However, I am also conducting research for an academic paper on bias in the civil court system, particularly regarding pro se litigants. A heavy silence fell over the courtroom. With your permission, Alex continued, I'd like to explain the scope of my research. Judge Blackwood's expression was unreadable, but she nodded. Please do. Alex turned slightly to address both the judge and the courtroom. Over the past year, I've been gathering data on how self-represented individuals are treated in various courts compared to those with attorneys. My preliminary findings indicated a significant disparity in judicial attention, procedural flexibility, and overall case outcomes that couldn't be explained by legal expertise alone. He gestured to his backpack. When my grandmother's situation arose, I saw an opportunity to experience this firsthand, rather than just analyzing court transcripts. I decided to represent her while initially presenting myself as an inexperienced teenager to observe how the court would respond. Judge Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "And what were your observations, Mr. Lynn?" Alex met her gaze directly. "In the first hearing, despite having all the same legal arguments and evidence I presented later, I was dismissed, ridiculed, and nearly lost by default simply because of how I was perceived. My arguments weren't evaluated on their merits until I demonstrated expertise that aligned with the court's expectations of what a real lawyer should sound like." The courtroom was completely silent now. Several attorneys in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor," Alex continued, "I want to be clear that this wasn't a deception intended to embarrass the court or opposing counsel. The research has been approved by Pacific Coast University's Ethics Committee, and I had planned to reveal my background at the conclusion of the case, along with my findings." Judge Blackwood was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Mr. Lynn, while I understand the academic value of your research, I'm concerned about the ethical implications of entering my courtroom under, let's call it a misleading presentation." "I understand your concern, Your Honor," Alex responded. "I never lied about my identity or credentials. I simply didn't volunteer information beyond what was asked. But I accept that my approach may have been inappropriate in certain respects." Judge Blackwood studied him, then turned to Parker. "Counselor, were you aware of Mr. Lynn's background?" Parker looked thoroughly discomfited. "No, Your Honor, I was not." "I see." Judge Blackwood tapped her fingers on the bench thoughtfully. "Mr. Lynn, do you believe your experiment, as it were, has concluded satisfactorily for your research purposes?" "Yes, Your Honor. I've gathered sufficient observational data." "Then I suggest we move forward with the actual case at hand, now with everyone's cards on the table." She looked between the two parties. "Unless there are any objections." Parker conferred briefly with his client before standing again. "Your Honor, in light of these unusual circumstances, my client would like to request a brief recess to reevaluate our position." "Granted. We'll take 30 minutes. Judge Blackwood tapped her gavel. "And Mr. Lynn, I'd like to see you in my chambers now." As the courtroom cleared, Alex gathered his materials and followed the bailiff toward the judge's chambers. The whispers followed him all the way to the door. Inside, Judge Blackwood gestured to a chair across from her desk. "That was quite a revelation, Mr. Lynn," she said once they were alone. "I must admit I'm both impressed and irritated." "I understand, Your Honor," Alex replied, "and I apologize for any disruption to your court." Judge Blackwood leaned forward. "Tell me honestly, was part of your research design intended to observe my specific reaction to you?" Alex hesitated. "Not initially, Your Honor. But when I saw the case was assigned to your courtroom, I did review your prior rulings involving pro-SC litigants." "And what did you find?" Her tone was neutral, professional, but there was an undercurrent of genuine curiosity. "A statistically significant pattern of shorter hearings, fewer questions to clarify legal arguments, and more summary judgments against self-represented parties compared to your colleagues on the bench." Alex spoke matter-of-factly, without accusation in his tone. Judge Blackwood sat back in her chair, her expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "I see, and your paper, when will it be published?" "It's still in the data collection phase. Publication would likely be next year." "I'd like to read it when it's complete," she said, surprising him. "And I'd like to know what conclusions you draw about my courtroom specifically." "Of course," Alex nodded. "Though I should mention that the paper doesn't name specific judges. It analyzes systemic patterns." Judge Blackwood considered this. "Perhaps it should name them. Accountability requires transparency, doesn't it?" Before Alex could respond, there was a knock at the door. The bailiff entered. "Your Honor, Mr. Parker has asked to speak with both you and Mr. Lynn. He says they have a proposal." Judge Blackwood glanced at Alex. "Well, it seems your unconventional approach may have moved things along after all. Shall we?" As they walked back toward the courtroom, she added quietly, "For what it's worth, Mr. Lynn, I believe your grandmother is fortunate to have you as her advocate. Regardless of how you chose to present yourself initially." Alex smiled slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor." "Don't thank me yet," she replied. We still have a case to resolve. And afterward, you and I are going to have a much longer conversation about judicial bias and your research methods. As they entered the courtroom, all eyes turned to them. Whatever came next, it was clear that this case had already changed everyone involved in ways none of them could have anticipated. When Judge Blackwood and Alex returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted yet again. Parker and his client, Michael Weber, were huddled together with their team, speaking in hushed tones. The gallery had grown even more crowded during the recess, with several courthouse staff finding excuses to slip in and witness the unusual proceedings. "Court is back in session," Judge Blackwood announced as she took her seat. "Mr. Parker, I understand you have something to discuss?" Parker stood, looking considerably less confident than he had at the start of the case. "Yes, Your Honor. After consulting with my client, we would like to propose a settlement." "I see," Judge Blackwood replied, glancing at Alex. "And what are the terms you're proposing?" Parker cleared his throat. "Riverfront Properties is willing to withdraw all claims regarding the property line encroachment, acknowledging the validity of the 1997 adjustment. We're also prepared to withdraw the covenant violation claims, provided that Mr. Lynn's grandmother allows our landscaping team to add some additional plantings around the ramp structure at our expense." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. This was essentially a complete concession. "Additionally," Parker continued, "my client would like to offer to cover any reasonable costs Mr. Lynn and his grandmother have incurred in defending this matter." Judge Blackwood raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a change in position, Mr. Parker. Mr. Lynn, your response?" Alex stood. "The landscaping addition is acceptable, Your Honor, provided my grandmother has final approval of the plants selected. As for the costs, that won't be necessary. My grandmother and I consider this matter resolved if Riverfront Properties will formally acknowledge in writing that her accessibility modifications comply with all neighborhood requirements and will not be challenged in the future." Judge Blackwood nodded. "Very reasonable, Mr. Parker." Parker conferred briefly with Weber, who nodded reluctantly. "We agree to those terms, Your Honor." "Excellent. I'll give you both 1 hour to draft and review the settlement agreement. We'll reconvene at 11:30 to finalize it." Judge Blackwood tapped her gavel. "Court is in recess." As people began to file out, Judge Blackwood added, "Mr. Lynn and Mr. Parker, please remain for a moment." When the courtroom had cleared except for the three of them, Judge Blackwood removed her glasses and addressed them both. "Gentlemen, while I'm pleased this matter is being resolved amicably, I believe there are some broader issues that deserve attention." She turned to Parker. "Mr. Parker, would you care to explain why your client pursued this case so aggressively when the documentation Mr. Lynn presented was readily available in public records?" Parker shifted uncomfortably. "Your Honor, our client was particularly motivated to acquire Mrs. Lynn's property. The accessibility modifications provided a convenient pretext for legal action that might pressure her to sell." "I suspected as much," Judge Blackwood said coldly. "And this approach has been successful for Riverfront Properties in the past?" Parker's silence was answer enough. "I see." Judge Blackwood made a note on her pad. "Mr. Lynn, I'm curious, did your research identify patterns of similar behavior by other real estate developers in our jurisdiction?" "Yes, Your Honor," Alex replied. "In fact, there are approximately 27 cases in the past 3 years where large property companies have used minor covenant violations to pressure elderly homeowners in gentrifying neighborhoods." Judge Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "I'd be interested in reviewing that data." She looked at Parker. "You may go prepare your settlement documents, Mr. Parker." After Parker left, Judge Blackwood turned her full attention to Alex. "Mr. Lynn, while your methods were unorthodox, they've brought to light issues that deserve serious consideration. I'd like to propose something to you." "I'm listening, Your Honor." "The Judicial Education Committee I chair is due to meet next month. I believe your research would be valuable to my colleagues, particularly if presented firsthand. Would you be willing to speak at that meeting?" Alex looked surprised. "Of course, Your Honor, I'd be honored." "Good. And there's one more thing." She hesitated briefly. "I've been on the bench for 15 years, Mr. Lynn. I'd like to think I've always been fair and impartial, but your presentation and my own reaction to you initially has given me pause. I'd appreciate your candid assessment of my handling of this case." Alex considered carefully before answering. "Your initial dismissiveness toward me was pronounced, Your Honor. You made several comments that reflected assumptions about my competence based solely on my appearance and apparent age. However, he added, your willingness to reconsider when presented with evidence speaks well to your fundamental fairness. Many judges might have found ways to punish me for my approach once my background was revealed. Judge Blackwood nodded slowly. Thank you for your honesty. I'll reflect on that. She gathered her papers. I'll see you at 11:30 for the settlement finalization. An hour later, the settlement was officially entered into the record. As the courtroom cleared, Alex found himself approached by several law students who had heard about the case and slipped in to watch. He answered their questions patiently until Judge Blackwood's clerk appeared at his elbow. Mr. Lin, the judge would like to see you in her chambers before you leave. In her office, Judge Blackwood was reviewing another case file when Alex knocked on the open door. Come in. Mr. Lin, please sit down. She set aside the file and leaned back in her chair. I wanted to speak with you privately now that the case is resolved. Of course, Your Honor. First, I want to apologize. Her direct approach surprised him. My behavior toward you in our first session was unprofessional and reflected precisely the kind of bias your research aims to document. That's not the kind of judge I aspire to be. I appreciate that, Your Honor, Alex replied, but my methodology was also flawed. I could have made the same point without the element of deception. She nodded. Perhaps. But sometimes we need to see our biases in action to truly recognize them. She opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder. After our conversation earlier, I had my clerk pull some statistics on my rulings over the past 5 years. She slid a printout across the desk. Pro se litigants in my courtroom have a 22% success rate compared to 58% for those with attorneys. I've always attributed that to the legal expertise attorneys bring, but your experiment suggests there may be more to it. Those numbers are consistent with national averages, Alex noted. The disparity exists throughout the system. That doesn't make it right, she replied firmly. Which brings me to my proposal. The county has been discussing a new legal aid program for self-represented litigants. I've been asked to help shape it, but I think your perspective would be valuable. Would you be interested in consulting on the project? Alex looked genuinely surprised. I would, Your Honor. Very much so. Good. And please, outside the courtroom, call me Diane. She handed him a business card. My personal email is on the back. Send me your research when it's ready, even in draft form. I will. Diane. She stood and extended her hand. Your grandmother is fortunate to have you, Mr. Lin. And perhaps our legal system will be fortunate as well if your research helps us address these disparities. As they shook hands, Alex smiled. That's the hope. Though I should mention, my grandmother was quite upset when she learned about my performance in your courtroom. She made me promise to invite you to dinner to apologize properly. Judge Blackwood laughed, a warm sound rarely heard in her courtroom. I'd like that. Tell her I accept. 2 weeks later, Alex stood before a garden ramp leading to his grandmother's front door. Fresh plants had been added around its base, softening its appearance while highlighting rather than hiding the structure. Judge Blackwood, Diane, stood beside him, a bottle of wine in hand as they prepared to enter for dinner. Your contractor did excellent work, she commented, examining the ramp. It really does blend with the house beautifully. My grandmother supervised every detail, Alex replied with a smile. She's quite particular about her home. As if on cue, the door opened to reveal a small, elegant woman with silver hair and bright, sharp eyes. She wore a traditional Chinese tunic over simple black pants, and her expression was one of polite formality. Judge Blackwood, she said with a slight bow. Welcome to my home. I hope you're hungry. I've been cooking all day despite my grandson telling me to keep it simple. Mrs. Lin, the pleasure is mine. And please call me Diane. She handed over the wine. I'm absolutely starving, and whatever you've made smells wonderful. Mrs. Lin smiled, her formality warming slightly. Come in, both of you. Alex, take her coat. As they settled in the cozy living room, Mrs. Lin fixed her grandson with a pointed look. Now, Judge, Diane, you must tell me honestly. Was my grandson very terrible in your courtroom? He won't give me all the details, Diane laughed. Actually, he was quite impressive, though his methods were unconventional. Unconventional. That's a polite way to put it. In my day, we respected our judges. We didn't play tricks on them. Despite her words, there was unmistakable pride in Mrs. Lin's eyes as she looked at her grandson. Well, his trick, as you call it, may end up helping many people, Diane replied. Sometimes we need to be shaken out of our routines to see things clearly. Mrs. Lynn nodded approvingly. Yes, this is wisdom. She stood. Now let's eat. I want to hear all about this committee you two are working on. And Alex, pour the wine. Our guest shouldn't have to wait. As they moved to the dining room, Diane caught Alex's eye and smiled. What had begun as an adversarial courtroom encounter had somehow transformed into something neither of them could have predicted, the beginning of a collaboration that might actually change things for the better. And all because a brilliant young lawyer had dared to appear as something other than what he was, to reveal a truth that might otherwise have remained hidden. 1 year later, the county courthouse was busier than usual. The largest conference room had been converted for a special presentation, with rows of chairs filled with judges, attorneys, law students, and community advocates. At the front of the room, a projection screen displayed the title, Equal Justice Addressing Bias in Self-Represented Litigation. Alex Lynn stood at the podium, dressed in a professional navy suit, but still with that slightly disheveled hair that had become his signature. At 25, he looked older than he had during his performance in Judge Blackwood's courtroom, but his youthful energy remained unmistakable. And so, as we conclude the pilot program's first year, he was saying, the data shows a 47% increase in favorable outcomes for self-represented litigants who participated in the pre-court preparation program. He clicked to the next slide showing a graph with a sharp upward trend. More importantly, exit surveys indicate that regardless of outcome, 89% of participants felt they were treated with respect and that their arguments were fully considered by the court. In the front row, Judge Diane Blackwood nodded approvingly. Beside her sat Mrs. Lynn, now 85, looking elegant in a teal dress, her silver hair perfectly styled. She beamed with obvious pride as her grandson fielded questions from the audience. A judge from the federal court raised his hand. Mr. Lynn, while these results are impressive, how do we know the improved outcomes aren't simply due to better preparation rather than reduced bias? Alex smiled. An excellent question, Your Honor. We actually controlled for that by tracking 2 separate metrics. First, we measured objective legal preparedness using a standardized assessment tool. Then separately, we tracked perception scores from both neutral courtroom observers and the litigants themselves. He clicked to a new slide showing a complex chart. What we found was that, even when controlling for improved preparation, litigants still experienced significantly better treatment and outcomes compared to our baseline. The conclusion is inescapable. When judges and court staff receive training on recognizing implicit bias, their behavior toward self-represented litigants measurably improved. The judge nodded. Looking thoughtful, from the middle of the room, Parker, Alex's former courtroom opponent, stood up. In the past year, he had surprisingly become one of the program's strongest supporters. As someone who's observed this program from its inception, Parker said, I can attest to its impact. I've seen judges who would previously have dismissed pro se arguments without much consideration, now engaging thoughtfully with self-represented parties. The culture is changing, and it's making our entire system more just. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Judge Blackwood caught Alex's eye and gave him a subtle thumbs up. After the formal presentation concluded, people gathered in small groups, discussing the findings and implications. Alex found himself surrounded by law students eager to learn more about his research methods. Professor Lynn, one student asked, do you ever regret your unorthodox approach in Judge Blackwood's courtroom? You could have faced serious consequences. Alex considered the question carefully. I don't recommend my methods, he replied with a smile, but I don't regret them either. Sometimes it takes an unexpected moment to break through established patterns. That said, there were more professional ways I could have made the same point. As the students continued their questions, Judge Blackwood approached with Mrs. Lynn. Alex, the Chief Justice would like to speak with you, Diane said. He's very interested in expanding the program statewide. Really? Alex looked surprised. That's ahead of schedule. Your results are compelling, she replied. And having Parker on board has helped convince some of the more skeptical members of the bench. Mrs. Lynn patted her grandson's arm. Go on, talk to the Chief Justice. I'll wait here with Diane. As Alex made his way across the room, Mrs. Lynn turned to Judge Blackwood with a knowing smile. When he was a little boy, he would put on his father's tie and pretend to be a lawyer, she said, always fighting for the underdog even then. But I never imagined he would end up changing the system itself. Diane watched Alex speaking animatedly with the Chief Justice. He has a gift, not just for the law, but for seeing problems others have learned to ignore. Like you, Mrs. Lynn replied. You saw your own bias when it was shown to you. Many would have been defensive, but you chose to learn instead. It wasn't easy, Diane admitted. 20 years on the bench thinking I was always fair and impartial. It's humbling to discover your blind spots. Humility is the beginning of wisdom, Mrs. Lynn said simply. Across the room, the conversation with the Chief Justice concluded with a handshake. As Alex made his way back, he was intercepted by a court clerk who handed him an envelope. When he rejoined his grandmother and Diane, he was reading the letter with an expression of disbelief. What is it? Diane asked. It's from the National Center for State Courts, Alex said, looking up. They want to fund an expansion of our program to 5 additional states as a pilot for potential national implementation. Mrs. Lynn clasped her hands together in delight. Wonderful news. There's more, Alex continued. They're citing our program as a model for addressing systemic bias in the courts. They want us both to speak at their annual conference next month. He looked at Diane. They specifically mentioned your role as a judge who was willing to acknowledge bias and work to address it. Diane took the letter, reading it with growing amazement. This is unexpected. You deserve it, Alex said sincerely. None of this would have happened if you hadn't been willing to listen and change. Most judges would have found a way to punish me for my deception and buried the underlying issues. Speaking of your deception, Diane said with a small smile, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. She glanced at Mrs. Lynn, who nodded encouragingly. Remember when you first revealed your true background in my courtroom? Of course, Alex replied. How could I forget? Well, I wasn't actually as surprised as I pretended to be, Diane admitted. I had already figured out who you were the night before. Alex's eyebrows shot up.
What? How?
When you presented those property documents so professionally, I knew something wasn't adding up. So I did a little research that evening and found your faculty profile and publications. I was prepared for your revelation before you made it. You never told me that. Alex looked genuinely surprised. Diane smiled. Sometimes a judge needs to maintain a bit of mystery too. Mrs. Lynn laughed. You two are so much alike. Always keeping secrets and revealing them at just the right moment. Before Alex could respond, Parker approached their group, now accompanied by Michael Weber, the owner of Riverfront Properties who had initiated the original lawsuit. Excuse the interruption, Parker said, looking slightly uncomfortable. Mr. Weber wanted to speak with you, Mrs. Lynn. The elderly woman regarded the property developer with polite but cool interest. Yes, Mr. Weber. Weber, a tall man in his 60s with a perpetually serious expression, cleared his throat. Mrs. Lynn, I owe you an apology. Our company's actions toward you and your property were inexcusable. I've come to realize that our aggressive expansion strategy has hurt many homeowners like yourself. Mrs. Lynn's expression remained neutral. And what has brought about this realization, Mr. Weber? Partly your grandson's program, Weber admitted. Parker insisted I attend one of the training sessions on housing justice and community displacement. It changed my perspective. He hesitated, then continued. I've decided to redirect our business model. We're launching a new division focused on creating accessible housing for seniors and people with disabilities who want to remain in their communities. This announcement clearly surprised everyone, including Parker. We'd like to consult with you if you're willing, Weber added. Your experience and insights would be valuable as we develop these properties. Mrs. Lynn studied him carefully as if assessing his sincerity. Finally, she nodded. I will consider it, Mr. Weber. Send me your proposal.